Greetings and peace. I would like to start this with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Peace be with you and yours. Today's presentation, I would like to cover a rare book by L.H. Anderson, author of Ancient Magic, Magnetism, and Psychic Forces from 1895. I hope you enjoy this, and I represent myself only. L.H. Anderson's name is Louis H. Anderson, but at that time, many people went by the British naming system, so they would use their first two letters as initials. So just for somebody that didn't know his name, it's Louis Anderson. Author and book study. This presentation is a close, chapter-by-chapter reading of Professor L.H. Anderson's 1895 Chicago volume, Ancient Magic, Magnetism, and Psychic Forces, The Key to Power. The aim is not to modernize Anderson's argument or turn his 19th century claims into present-day facts, but to explain what the book actually says, how its ideas connect, and how its argument develops from ancient magic through magnetism, hypnotism, spiritualism, willpower, and the nature of life. Anderson repeatedly argues that phenomena once labeled magic, miracle, sorcery, clairvoyance, or spiritual mystery should be compared with experiences he calls magnetic or psychic. The presentation therefore distinguishes Anderson's worldview from established modern science while preserving his terminology, examples, religious references, historical comparisons, and moral conclusions. Biographical profile. The strongest bibliographic identification is L.H. Anderson, whose initials stand for Louis H. Anderson. The Library of Congress catalogs his 1893 book, How to Win, under Anderson, L.H., Louis H., and identifies its publisher as the National Hygienic Institute in Chicago. A later edition of that work describes Anderson as a professor and principal of the National Hygienic Institute in Chicago, and places his teaching within the period's culture of personal magnetism, hypnotism, and psychotherapeutic instruction. Now, the 1895 book itself identifies Anderson as Professor L.H. Anderson, locates the publication at the National Institute, Masonic Temple in Chicago, and says that he had spent 18 years investigating magnetic phenomena. The text portrays him as a lecturer, experimenter, author, and teacher who wanted to connect occult traditions with laws of nature. The evidence establishes his Chicago institutional and publishing context. It does not by itself establish a specific Masonic Lodge membership, so that label should be treated cautiously rather than presented as independently verified biography. So at that time, a lot of his books were published under the National Institute with the Masonic Temple in Chicago. And a lot of his books are very hard to find. They're rare. The information is hard to find. So the only person or individuals that could verify his membership, if he was a Freemason, is the Grand Lodge of Illinois, in Chicago. So in the genealogy, they could verify if Professor Louis H. Anderson was a member. And I think if he was, then that's their duty to preserve his teachings and the information that he had presented. But without further ado, let's get into the information. Intro: Anderson's intentions. Anderson begins by defending the study of unusual psychological phenomena against two opposite reactions, superstition and denial. He argues that strange experiences have been part of human history, and that rarity does not automatically make an event supernatural. His preferred method is comparative. Observe phenomena, search history for similar reports, compare them, and look for recurring laws. He presents magnetism as a bridge between older accounts of magic and newer investigations of mind and behavior. He says his interest arose from long experimentation and from a conviction that magnetic phenomena showed regularity. Once he believed recurring effects could be found, he searched older traditions for parallels. The author repeatedly admits that some principles may be uncertain and that readers should test applications rather than accept his authority. At the same time, he frames the project spiritually. Science, religion, psychology, history, and the inner life of humanity are supposed to converge on a larger understanding of human potential and destiny. Chapter 1, Phenomena of Magnetism. Anderson's first chapter argues that magnetism can explain experiences once treated as miracles. He says human beings are astonished by rare effects because they do not understand their causes, and he applies this principle to dreams, somnambulism, unusual mental states, and what he calls psychic phenomena. The mind, in his account, is far more powerful and complex than ordinary measurement suggests. He therefore treats magnetism as both an anthropological and psychological subject, not merely a physical property of iron. The chapter defines animal magnetism, life magnetism, and mesmerism as related ways of describing a power or influence operating through living beings. Anderson says personal magnetism can be expressed through proximity, the hands, the eyes, words, and intentional action. He describes physical and psychological effects, including sleep-like states, somnambulism, clairvoyance, and other extraordinary conditions. His central historical claim is that magnetism is not new. Similar phenomena appear across peoples and ages, while the newer task is to collect those fragments and formulate a rational system. Chapter 2, Magic, Black and White. Anderson divides magic morally into higher and lower forms. White or good magic is associated with spiritual development, divine cooperation, self-mastery, and the use of unusual human capacities for beneficial purposes. Black magic, by contrast, is linked to selfishness, deception, harmful enchantment, evil spirits, and the misuse of powers. He argues that ancient people often interpreted natural human capacities as supernatural because they lacked another explanatory framework. A large part of the chapter works through religious and Kabbalistic categories of purity, impurity, magic, astrology, and contact with spiritual forces. Anderson discusses the idea that moral corruption can radiate outward and that purity increases sensitivity to evil or discord. He distinguishes forbidden practices from the mere study of them, noting traditions in which judges or religious authorities had to understand magic in order to condemn it. His recurring lesson is ethical. Unusual power is not automatically good. Its moral direction depends upon the character and intention of the person using it. Chapter 3, Dreams and Visions. The third chapter turns inward, treating dreams and visions as forms of perception that may arise independently of ordinary outward senses. Anderson distinguishes the seer from the poet. Although he thinks the two can overlap, the poet receives and shapes inner images, while the seer is categorized by an inward seeing that may resemble clairvoyance. He treats artistic genius as a gift that unfolds from within rather than something that can simply be manufactured by technique. Now, the discussion then connects ancient prophetic traditions with magnetism. Anderson compares accounts of Moses, Israelite prophets, Christ, the apostles, and other sacred figures with phenomena such as rapport, laying on of hands, faith healing, prophecy, and clairvoyance. He is careful at moments to say that Christian miracles should not simply be reduced to magnetism, yet he sees analogies between biblical healing and magnetic manipulation. The chapter culminates in his thesis that true magic lies in the hidden powers of the mind, and that magnetism may provide a key for investigating them. Chapter 4, Secrets of Egyptian Magi. Anderson presents ancient Egypt as a major repository of concealed knowledge. He believes the Egyptian priesthood understood magnetism, healing, altered states, and the methods for developing psychic capacities, but deliberately restricted this knowledge to initiates. The chapter's recurring image is the veil. Ordinary consciousness hides capacities. that can become accessible when the senses are quieted and the inner life becomes dominant. He emphasizes the will, the hands, and the possibility of magnetic sleep. The laying on of hands receives special attention because Anderson interprets it as a recurring historical form of healing and transmission. The Bible is then treated as a particularly important record because, in his view, it preserves principles of purification, faith, healing, and spiritual development. The chapter blends Egyptian priestly traditions, biblical interpretation, and Anderson's magnetic theory into a single historical narrative in which ancient religious practice becomes an early expression of psychic science. So basically, all of these teachings are telling you to think good, know good, do good, be in a state of silence and purity in your thought, in your deeds, in your action, in your appearance. And when you keep yourself pure, neat, and clean, right, and you live a good, clean, healthy life, then that charisma and magnetism comes to you naturally. Chapter 5, The Law of Attraction. This chapter expands magnetism into a theory of mind. Anderson describes magnetism as an attracting power operating throughout life and proposes that thought itself can act as a force. He discusses the universal will, intuition, genius, seership, and thought transference, presenting them as related expressions of a broader law of attraction. His argument assumes that mental states are not sealed inside isolated individuals, but can influence other minds through an unseen medium. Anderson compares mental attraction with physical attraction and gravity. The psychic ether becomes a conceptual medium through which thoughts might pass, and hypnotism becomes a concentrated example of influence between minds. Historical figures such as Plato, Voltaire, Thomas Paine, and Rousseau are invoked in connection with inspiration and exceptional thought. The chapter is less a laboratory demonstration than a 19th century metaphysical synthesis. Human consciousness is treated as active, relational, and potentially capable of communicating beyond ordinary sensory channels. Chapter 6, The Key to Occultism. Anderson next connects hypnotism with mystical practice. He treats artificial sleep, self-hypnotization, trance, clairvoyance, clairaudience, and mystical illumination as points on a continuum in which ordinary consciousness gives way to a more inward state. Mysticism is presented not simply as fantasy, but as an attempt to enter what Anderson calls the interior life. He describes stages of inner development, the castle of the interior person, spiritual transport, and mystical love. The chapter also surveys hypnotism as a therapeutic and experimental subject. Anderson refers to surgical operations performed during trance, curative effects, therapeutic phenomena, and the transmission of a vital force. He cites the existence of an odic force and compares faith healing and Christian Science healing with magnetic and hypnotic processes. Throughout, he treats hypnosis as a practical doorway into occult investigation, while also emphasizing discipline, aspiration, self-control, and the moral purpose of the person seeking unusual states of consciousness. Chapter 7, Modern Spiritualism. Anderson treats modern spiritualism as another field in which older magic, hypnotism, and psychic phenomena overlap. He says spiritualistic experiences may include phenomena that do not fit comfortably within the known laws of nature, but he does not recommend approaching them merely for amusement. Instead, he argues that serious investigation requires a disciplined, spiritually prepared mind and appropriate conditions, including attention to atmosphere and the disposition of the participants. A major concern is fraud. Anderson acknowledges that spiritualism can attract imposters and therefore discusses the causes of deception and the importance of detecting fraudulent performances. He also distinguishes genuine mediumistic capacity from deliberate theatrical manipulation. Like his treatment of magic, his treatment of spiritualism is moral as well as experimental. Powers should not be prostituted for curiosity, money, or vanity. He presents spiritualism as a possible royal road, into mystery, while insisting that its investigation should not be undertaken by people whose motives and characters are serious enough to handle the subject. Chapter 8, Power of Human Will. The 8th chapter places will at the center of Anderson's theory. He argues that a hypnotist can influence the thoughts, feelings, and actions of another person through concentrated will or soul influence. Some subjects, he says, are more sensitive because their mental organization is more receptive, while others resist because competing influences are stronger. Hypnotic sensitivity is therefore described as an interaction between the operator and the mental condition of the subject. Anderson uses this framework to discuss free will, concentration, and mental receptivity. He suggests that people may sometimes experience another person's intention as if it were an impulse arising inside their own minds. The chapter therefore raises a moral problem. If will can influence behavior, where does responsibility begin and end? Anderson does not reduce human agency to helplessness, but he does argue that the strength, direction, and susceptibility of will differ among people. The chapter prepares the ground for his later discussion of magnetized persons and responsibility for conduct. Chapter 9, Magnetic Soul Force. Here, Anderson develops the will into a more expansive soul force. Language and gesture are treated as surface expressions of a deeper energy that can, in his view, operate without physical contact. He discusses firmness, concentration, personal influence, and the possibility that some individuals can impress their intentions upon others across considerable distance. Animals are also included in the discussion, especially as examples of beings that can be affected by human attention and command. The chapter gathers a striking collection of 19th century occult claims: invisible influence, self-willing, fascination, birthmarks allegedly connected with mental impressions, the searching gaze attributed to Napoleon, and the supposed capacity to affect people many miles away. Anderson treats these not as unrelated curiosities, but as manifestations of one's underlying magnetic energy. The conceptual move is important. Personal influence is no longer merely social charisma. In Anderson's system, it becomes a quasi-physical extension of consciousness, capable of acting through space and producing effects in other organisms. Chapter 10, Magnetized Persons. Anderson now applies his theory of influence to crime and moral judgment. If a person can be strongly affected by another person's will, he argues society should be cautious before assuming that every harmful act is entirely self-originated. Criminal behavior in this framework may sometimes involve the influence of another will. The chapter therefore shifts from occult experimentation to a social philosophy of punishment and responsibility. So if you look at the Charles Manson stuff, this kind of makes sense. His moral conclusion is deliberately humane. Anderson criticizes capital punishment and argues that prevention, kindness, and moral cultivation are better responses to wrongdoing than vengeance. He urges readers to regard guilty people with sadness rather than hatred, and to recognize the natural laws governing human behavior. The galvanic battery is invoked as an analogy for demonstrating how external forces can affect the system. Whether or not one accepts his magnetic theory, the chapter's central ethical proposition is clear, right? Understanding causation should make society more compassionate, right? And more interested in preventing crime than merely punishing it. We are all human beings. We are all walking each other home. And this is what Professor L.H. Anderson is trying to knock that sense into humanity, right? Even at that time in the 1800s. Chapter 11, Mind Strengthens Body. Anderson turns to the relationship between mental states and physical vitality. He argues that love, enthusiasm, hope, will, and other mental conditions can change the way the body functions and can make difficult exertions feel easier. He uses reports of Indian fakirs, right, from Sufism and the Hindu yogic aspects, trance, suspended animation, somnambulism, and other extraordinary states as examples of the mind apparently overriding ordinary bodily limitations, where the human being is capable of so much, right? It all depends on the mind and how our bodies overcome these feats. The chapter also explores anticipation and far-seeing, including the ideas that coming events may cast shadows in consciousness before they occur. Anderson discusses developments from microscopic reproductive beginnings towards the mature human organism and uses this continuity to support a larger argument about the hidden powers of life. The grave, he says, is not the final home because life is ultimately connected with immortality. The result is a broad mind-body philosophy in which health, vitality, consciousness, and spiritual destiny are treated as different expressions of one living process. Chapter 12, The Origin of Force. Anderson begins this chapter with a law-like principle. No effect exists without a cause, and every product results from a chain of causes. He invokes action and reaction, attraction and counter-attraction, heredity, and the persistence of impressions. His purpose is to make magnetic and psychic phenomena appear continuous with general natural law rather than expectations to it. Even unusual effects, he argues, should ultimately have causes that can be discovered. The discussion then becomes historical and speculative. Anderson proposes that clairvoyance might enable access to remote periods and extinct forms of life, and he criticizes approaches that invoke mental or spiritual effects without sufficiently general laws. J. Rhodes Buchanan and human phrenology are brought into the argument as examples of attempts to map mental and bodily characteristics. The chapter's underlying strategy is consistent with the whole book. Replace isolated marvels with a universal causal framework, even when the proposed framework remains speculative by modern standards. Chapter 13, Vital Magnetic Force. Anderson treats vital force as a major determinant of the quality of human life. He does not describe it as a blind energy. Instead, he presents it as something connected with happiness, constitution, emotion, thought, and interpersonal exchange. The brain is compared with an electrical machine, while thoughts are treated as active realities. Some people are said to attract others strongly, while others are experienced as repellent, with personal magnetism explaining part of this difference. Sexual magnetism receives special emphasis because Anderson regards it as one of the strongest forms of attraction. He describes magnetic exchange, reciprocity, emotional magnetism, and the pleasure of intellectual or personal contact as related processes. The chapter therefore moves beyond hypnotism and occult practice into an attempt to explain ordinary human relationships through magnetic language. Attraction, affection, desire, conversation, and social bonding are interpreted as exchanges of vital influence, making magnetism a general theory of interpersonal life. Chapter 14, Mental Inspiration. This chapter introduces a spiritual hierarchy of minds. Anderson describes God as the mind of all minds and presents religion as the highest expression of humanity. The greater mind can inspire the lesser, and magnetism becomes the proposed medium through which feeling, thought, and influence move between persons. Pain and emotional states are also discussed as conditions that can be modified through directed influence. Anderson then uses electrical analogies to describe dual and cross currents, cohesion and complementary forces. Sexual attraction is treated as one expression of a broader duality that appears throughout nature. The point is not simply that electricity resembles magnetism, but that polarity becomes a model for understanding human relationships, inspiration, emotion, and social interdependence. The chapter ultimately argues that people share common interests because they participate in a larger field of reciprocal influence. Chapter 15, Kinds of Magnetism. Anderson broadens the concept of magnetism into a taxonomy. He distinguishes physical or electrical magnetism from affectional, personal, animal, and celestial forms. The lodestone and magnetic needle provide familiar physical images, while human attraction provides the psychological counterpart. He asks why some people draw crowds while others repel them, and answers in terms of the quality and development of their personal magnetic atmosphere. Affection is elevated as a particularly important form of magnetism, with truth described as one of the strongest possible objects of attachment. Conjugal love, maternal love, intellectual fellowship, and even the attraction of people toward lower pleasures are fitted into the same framework. Anderson argues that education itself could be transformed by recognizing personal magnetism, and that a new age of wisdom may emerge. The chapter is therefore both descriptive and utopian. It imagines a future in which understanding attraction and influence would reshape relationships, education, and civilization. And he's right? Like if you look at it from the 1800s and how even today in America, he basically predicted the future. People treat you on your appearance, your etiquette, your posture, how you carry yourself, how you're treating self and others. This is super important, right? That etiquette and approaching people the right way. And they teach you that in modern American society. Like, you need those abilities and skills in order to make it here. That's just the unfortunate truth. Chapter 16, Laws Governing Magnetism. The 16th chapter attempts to formalize the recurring principles Anderson has been proposing. He states that things tend to produce or attract their like, and that all beings participate in a universal creative power. Human attractiveness, sexual differentiation, food, mental development, terrestrial sight, and celestial vision are brought under the same broad system. The language is intentionally universal. Magnetism is not a specialized occult trick, but a principle supposed to operate throughout nature. Now, the social implications are equally important. Anderson argues for equal rights and presents human beings as parts of one whole rather than isolated units. Food is said to influence the mind, showing how the physical and mental are linked in his model. The chapter's method is cumulative rather than experimental, right? Observations about attraction, development, diet, sexuality, and consciousness are gathered under a single metaphysical law. Anderson's laws should therefore be read as his 19th century theoretical synthesis, not as equivalent to experimentally established physical laws. But from the Sufi aspect, what he's telling you from the Islamic aspect is even what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught us, that a Muslim is like one body, right? If one of your brothers and sisters is in pain, that means you have a duty to help them. And in the Quran, it tells us to help one another, right? We're all walking each other home, and we owe this love and light to one another in this short human journey. It tells us that if you help or save one person, it's like you did it for all of humanity. And if you hurt, right, or you kill or whatever, one person, it's like you did it to all of humanity. So we're all one consciousness, right, manifested in different physical avatars. The Sufi teachings call this the Wahdat al-Wajud, that we are all connected to Allah, right, the mind of all minds, as Anderson describes. And we are all here, right, to better ourselves and to know thyself, to know each other, to know the world around us. And in that path, basically God makes us the vicegerent, representative, deputized of God on this earth. So we are the highest ranking creature in this earth, after God, not only on this earth, but in the entire cosmos, after the Creator itself. So human beings are really powerful. Our potential, our responsibility for self and each other, we have to take this stuff seriously. We have to think good thoughts, right? Eliminate bad thoughts and bad habits. Keep ourselves pure in our clothing, the way we're carrying ourselves, right? Make sure our bodies are clean. We're not like drinking or doing drugs. Our habits are healthy. So all of that will increase not only your light, but also your personal magnetism. So I'm adding my analysis of what Anderson is describing here. Chapter 17, The Element of Life. The final chapter asks the largest questions: what life is, where it comes from, whether life can truly die, and how human beings develop their inner capacities. Anderson rejects the idea of death as absolute extinction and describes life as a change of condition. So we merely end one phase and go to the next phase when we drop these physical avatars. Reproduction becomes evidence of a universal continuity, while education is interpreted as an unfolding of interior possibilities rather than the mere filling of an empty mind, right? The chapter returns to intuition, self-education, health, and the divinity within the person. Anderson argues that people are largely blind to the wealth of their own interior nature and should learn to recognize the sources of inspiration present in life and nature. Strong, robust, magnetic health is linked to happiness, while spiritual development is presented as the completion of human potential. The book therefore ends where it begins. Unusual powers are not treated merely as spectacles, but as clues to a larger theory of human nature, spiritual destiny, and the hidden resources of consciousness. So basically, know thyself, know thy Lord, know thyself, and you know the universe around you, right? And even the Quranic aspect where Allah tells you that I am closer to you than your jugular vein. God is within us, in our hearts, the station of the heart. The Sufi master Rumi tells us that listen to that voice that does not speak. So when you meditate and you're in stillness, what Anderson is describing even in these teachings, then that magnetism and gnosis comes to you. Even in the book of Psalms, right, in the Bible, be still and know I am God. Practice stillness, purity, and the gnosis and magnetism comes to you naturally. And this is super important in these teachings, and we must take it seriously. And even when you have to take important life decisions, just sit down for 5 minutes, meditate, and listen to that voice in your heart that does not speak. That's your direct connection as a human being, as the highest ranking creature to God itself, right? This is why the angels were told to bow before Adam. We have a special role in this universe, and we gotta, know who we are and come to our senses and stop this trivial stuff that we are destroying each other over race, religion, destroying the planet. We need to make our lives, each other, and the planet a better place for all. This is our responsibility to do so. Anderson's central argument: across all 17 chapters, Anderson repeatedly performs the same intellectual maneuver. He takes an old category, magic, miracle, prophecy, spiritualism, clairvoyance, healing, or occult influence, and asks whether a common principle might explain apparently different cases. Magnetism is his preferred organizing concept. It allows him to connect physical analogies, interpersonal attraction, hypnotic influence, altered states, religious experience, and spiritual development within one continuous story of nature. The second half of the argument is ethical and spiritual. Power without character becomes black magic, deception, exploitation, or crime. Power directed toward goodness becomes healing, compassion, self-mastery, and spiritual progress. Anderson therefore does not separate his science of magnetism from a moral philosophy. A person who develops unusual influence must also develop wisdom, purity, restraint, faith, and responsibility. His ideal is not simply a powerful individual, but a human being whose inner capacities are aligned with a higher purpose. So basically, be a good human being with a pure heart, pure intentions. You will be loved, protected, and provided for, and that magnetism will help you fulfill your life's purpose. And everyone carries on, right? That's what we're here to do. And it's important, even in the Sufi teachings, to not think any dirty or impure thoughts. So first, control your thoughts, then control your actions, circumscribe your desires, and live within due bounds, right? Even with the Masonic teachings and all of that in between is you must control your ego, your lower senses, your lower self, the nafs, right? The ego in Arabic, and all of that in between. And then you come into your higher and divine nature, right? Listen to good music, eat good food, avoid like bad company, bad habits, bad lifestyle, and naturally that light and healing and magnetism comes to you. Historical method. The book is deliberately eclectic, right? Anderson moves among biblical passages, Kabbalistic traditions, Egyptian priesthood, Greek and Roman philosophy, medieval magic, mesmerism, hypnotism, modern spiritualism, psychology, electricity, anthropology, and contemporary writers on occult subjects. He sees recurring motifs across these sources, right? Attraction, influence, altered consciousness, healing, prophecy, hidden knowledge, and the interaction of mind with body and environment. This method explains both the book's richness and its limitations. Anderson is not writing a modern controlled study. He is constructing a comparative synthesis in which historical reports, religious narratives, personal observations, analogies, and contemporary occult literature are treated as evidence of underlying continuity. The result is valuable as a record of 19th century occult thought and as a map of Anderson's intellectual mind. But his explanations should remain clearly attributed to Anderson, right, rather than presented as established contemporary science. So this is something that I believe he should be given his due respect and credit, and it makes sense why the book is so heavily censored, it's not available anywhere, and why this work should be shared with everyone. And I believe since his work was exclusive for the Masonic Temple in Chicago, if there's any genealogical proof, right, from the Grand Lodge of Illinois that Anderson was a Mason, then I believe they should celebrate him and make sure that his teachings and information is circulated out there. Key concepts of the book. 4 ideas dominate the book. First is magnetism, understood as an invisible influence that can be physical, psychological, interpersonal, or spiritual. Second is will, which Anderson treats as an active force capable of directing attention and influence. Third is mind, whose powers he believes extend beyond ordinary sensory awareness. Fourth is attraction, which becomes a universal model for relationships among people, thoughts, bodies, and the natural world. These ideas reinforce one another. The will directs magnetism. Magnetism produces attraction. Attraction creates influence. And influence can affect body, emotion, thought, and behavior. Anderson repeatedly uses electrical and magnetic analogies to give this system a naturalistic appearance. Yet the system remains broader than 19th century physics. It includes morality, religion, prophecy, spiritualism, and immortality. Right? The key to power promised by the title is therefore ultimately a theory of human potential rather than a single mechanical technique. But those that become, let's say, even the fakirs, the Sufi fakirs in India and Pakistan, or those that are in the Sufi path, those that are in traditional spiritual religious paths, they become masters, clairvoyants. We as human beings are powerful. So if we follow these teachings, right, with a sincere heart, mind, body, and soul, then we have the potential to become exactly that. So we must take this seriously. Moral philosophy. One of the book's most consistent themes is that unusual ability is morally neutral until it is directed by character. Anderson contrasts good and evil magic, warns against deception and indiscretion, criticizes exploitative mediumship, and argues that willpower should not be used selfishly. He repeatedly invokes humility, purity, faith, restraint, and responsibility as conditions for the legitimate development of unusual capacities. His treatment of crime makes the point especially sharply. If people can be influenced by stronger wills, society should understand causes before condemning individuals. Anderson consequently favors prevention, kindness, and moral rehabilitation over vengeance. This does not make the book politically systematic, but it does give the occult theory a definite ethical purpose. The ultimate standard is whether knowledge increases human happiness, reduces suffering, strengthens character, and moves people toward what Anderson understood as divine and spiritual development. So basically, it's all about loving each other, uniting with each other, uplifting with each other, and creating a better world. Now, the supposed spiritual communities and the conscious communities of today are totally the opposite of that. They're always putting each other down. They're arguing with each other about who's right and who's wrong. And even myself personally, I don't even engage with somebody who wants to engage in any negative behavior, right? Because if you're going to stop, at every dog that barks, you're not going to reach your destination. So you got to keep walking your path. And we have to promote the society that Anderson is teaching us to do here, right? And consideration for one another, especially in these times that we are living in. Thank you for watching. If any questions or comments, please email me at salmansheikh911@gmail.com. And of course, all my work and videos are for the purpose of fair use. Copyright laws under free speech, education and entertainment purposes, and information and nonprofit purposes. Thank you so much. All rights reserved.